Well, thank you for having me here. If you cannot hear me, just speak up. My voice is not as good as it used to be. There was a time when I could speak to 300 people without any amplification. A few days ago, we and the world around us commemorated the liberation of Auschwitz. And I was not liberated until April 27th, 1945, then in Bavaria, near Landsberg, in a sub-camp of Dachau, named Kaufering. I've spoken before about my experiences, and I do it as often as I can, emotionally. It's not easy. In fact, it gets more difficult as time goes on. So I ask you to bear with me if my voice or I should falter. It is nearly impossible to summarize what went on then, and I've given up on that. And what I can do is answer your questions, and that is really the way for me to know what it is that you want to know. I trust that you have read about the Shoah. Some of you are well versed, some of you are maybe scholars in it. I do read as much as I can, but mostly I deal with it as a survivor with memories. My trade now is being a painter. That's my profession. I painted last night, I painted a tiny bit this morning, not nearly enough. What is my subject matter? The Tanakh and the Shoah, but you would never see it. That is visually not. That is, I paint feelings, I paint attitudes, I paint ideas. To the extent that I can, I communicate these things, and then it is for you, the viewer, to decide what you want to read into it. I sat this morning in the cafeteria with two young ladies, and they, in a way, gave me the themes, because what they were interested in, I'm assuming that you too are. One of them was, how do I feel about it today? In a strange way, I'm thrown back to a long, long time ago, 1932. I lived then in Prague, and a 9-year-old, not quite 10-year-old, things developed around us. That is, I was barely aware of it, but it was a subject matter of our discussion around the table. And I realized that things happened in Germany that were difficult, hostile, and with some difficulty to understand. That is, 1932 is when the Nazis started to take over in Germany. Czechoslovakia, Prague then in Czechoslovakia, was a democracy, not a perfect one, certainly not. But compared to the countries around, it was a place where Jews could live and work and be tolerated. It took only 7 years, 1939, before Czechoslovakia was dismantled by consent of Daladier and Chamberlain, and the country was reduced to a dictatorship, someone close to Nazi dictatorship. In 1939, Prague was occupied by Nazi troops, and the Jewish community of Prague was subject to all the laws that the Nazis had imposed on Jews of Germany. That is, we lost everything we had, freedom, possessions, and so on. I will not recapitulate things that you may have read about or know about. And the reason I'm recalling it now is that I wondered then, as I wonder now, what happened? How come that a civilized community would allow itself to be run by scoundrels, by near criminals, and allowed their, at least nominally, legal community to be subverted and to live in a dictatorship? The same ideas go through my mind today, and I know I'm giving you a campaign speech. Laws were neglected, lies were accepted, history was falsified, and eventually that led to the war in 1939. I don't have to give you details about that, you know that. I was in hiding for a while, was betrayed, and in 1941, on October 5th, 1941, was put into my first concentration camp. Lipa, a quote-unquote good camp. Nobody got killed there. From there to Terezin, Theresienstadt, and you may have read about it. Quite a bit of literature exists about it. And in 1944, was shipped from Terezin to Auschwitz. Auschwitz being in the process of liquidation, I was shipped from there in a long and difficult train ride to Kaufering, a sub-camp of Dachau. And I was liberated there on April 27th by the Patton's Third Army, sweeping down into southern Germany to the Alps from central Germany through Bavaria. On liberation, I weighed 50 pounds, give or take, 50 kilos, give or take 75, 77 pounds, and pretty much near death. Upon liberation, yes, I was exhilarated. I knew I had made it. But I wasn't sure that I would make it much beyond that. I was pretty much gone by then. By sheer luck, I somehow managed to get through the next week, next month, and slowly, very, very slowly gained my strength. Strong enough to be shipped back to Prague, my hometown. There, I very fortunately met a friend, a girlfriend from before the war. There were very few youngsters of marriageable age, both male or female. And the logical thing happened. We got married to each other. I married my first wife, Stella, who was a wonderful person, but badly, badly mauled by the war. Today we have names for that. Post-traumatic syndromes, bipolar, and so on. She was suicidal. She was so suicidal that I could not leave her alone for a moment. And that led very logically to the question, well, how do I make a living? And I became a painter. That kept me in the house. And by some sheer luck, I managed to make my livelihood, or laughingly referred to as my livelihood, as a painter. And that is what I'm doing today. All these years, there was one thing that kept me going, and that is memories. While in the camps, and particularly in the last camps, Kaufering, we had promised each other, if against all odds one of us should survive, she would tell the world what it was like. That's what I'm doing today. Except that I cannot. It cannot be told. It cannot be described. Yes, there are books about it, but description is nearly impossible. I'm not going to try to add to that. You know the books, you know the literature, you've seen the documentaries. But I'm doing what I promised, what we promised to each other, to talk about it. Now, after the war, first returning home to Prague, the first was rejection. Nobody wanted to hear from us. Nobody wanted to hear what happened to us, our families, our community. There were few survivors of the Prague Jewish community. Eventually I managed somehow to earn enough of an income and start living a quote as normal life as I could. I didn't realize that around me politics were changing, and I realized that I would be living in a new dictatorship. And I decided to leave Czechoslovakia in '46 with illegal papers and went to Paris as a refugee. Then thereby became a stateless Jewish war refugee. I was wrong. '46 was still all right, sort of. The communists took over in '48, and I felt that one dictatorship per life is all that I needed. Eventually, in 1952, I came to this country and continued being a painter. It would be difficult to describe in detail what I did from day to day. Essentially, trying to keep alive, stay alive, keep busy, and be involved. And that, I think, was what keeps me going to this day. Be involved, to be part of the world around me, and to push those, not push, but foster and talk those ideas that are important to me. What I've learned over these many years is what counts. Not wealth, not renown, not fame, but how to live in a community. And what was the community I was striving for? One that tried for fairness, balance, freedom, and one idea, namely that we are all responsible for each other. I could, as you can tell, that I can talk about many, many different subjects. But I feel that you should have a chance to ask me. Here you have a survivor, one of the handful that are still around, still eloquent enough and even strong enough to listen. So if you have some ideas that are in your mind, if you have questions that are there, I'll try my best to answer them. But understand, you're talking just one person out of the many, many, too many, who cannot talk for themselves. So please raise your hand and talk. I know the first one is always difficult. All right, you sir, in the blue shirt. Pardon? Use the microphone, Bear. Oh, I'm sorry, gentlemen, yes.
Thank you. Thank you. Is it on? It's on. Your first comment was how the current situation is bringing to mind the Nazis' rise to power and all the war happened. What didn't happen then that we should do now to prevent something like that happening again?
I've wondered very, not just I, we, the community, now I'm talking about the Prague Jewish community, what was happening in a country that was overridden by a bunch of scoundrels. Now, we had no illusions about the Nazis. And so when, not too long ago, things happening around me, I heard echoes. And I wondered, why do I blame the Nazis rising to the non-participation of the population at large? If in Central Europe, and not just in Germany, but in Hungary, Austria, and the other dictatorships, Italy, Spain, if enough people had said no and be actively politically involved, all these scoundrels, criminals, could not have gotten to power. And my answer was, and is, to be involved. Don't let the scoundrels take over. I'm sorry to give you a campaign speech, but that is what we felt then, and somewhere there is an echo in me today. There was somebody else out there and up.
You've said that we do know, we've heard of the horrific things that happened. Was there a particular kindness that nourished your soul to help you survive?
I didn't quite get it. Speak louder.
Okay, sorry. You said that we all know of the horrific things that happened or have seen documentaries. Was there a particular kindness, something that you recall that helped to nourish your soul to help you survive?
You're asking a very difficult question, namely, how did we manage to survive? And I should have talked about this a lot more before, so I'm giving you the conclusion of it, rather. We, survivors, how come we survived the concentration camps? We stayed what we were. We had values about decency, about truth, about facts, and we respected them. We knew what was right and what was wrong. We didn't need the law to tell us what decency, what fairness, what civility was. And I think that keeping these things alive within us and within those limited communities kept us going. Theresienstadt comes to mind, and even other camps, where we live by our old ethos, by old ideas. We said, please and thank you, and how do you do? We addressed each other by name with a lot of politeness and kindness. And I think that holding up these values is what kept us going. That is to remain a civilized community. In my case, the community of Prague, a largely bilingual Czech and German Jewish community, not religious, but culturally quite involved in the community and in the cultural world around them. So I think it is a value system that held us, kept us going, even when things got very, very bad. And the last camp, Kaufering, comes to mind, which was the deadliest of them all. That is, if you survived Auschwitz, if you didn't get into the gas, you didn't stay in Auschwitz long before being shipped out. Even there in Kaufering, there was a kind of civility that kept us going. We knew who we were, and we knew who our guards were. We knew the SS, and we would not imitate them by being brutal, lying. We respected life, we respected each other. Far too few survived. But even those who died with these ideas. It kept us going throughout the years. Yeah, more questions? Yes, sir.
You didn't mention your family. What happened?
Unfortunately, I have to keep it very short. I'm the only survivor in the family. I say to other people, think of a family gathering. When you all get together, cousins, uncles, aunts, cousins twice and three times removed, close friends, the entire clan, your cultural world. In my case, nobody. They all perished. And I'm the left one.
Can you tell us about your experience after the Nazis invaded Prague and how you managed to evade capture for a short period of time?
It took only very little time for the Nazis to take over the Jewish community. They had our lists, they knew who we were or where we were. It was a well-organized community. And I know the argument, you shouldn't have been organized, but we were a community. And the community has a bony structure and is knowing about each other. So it was not difficult for the Nazis to locate us. It was a small community, small, about 30,000 out of a community of 1 million. A very small percentage, a visible target. On the other hand, a very proud community. If you go into the history books and read about the Jews of Prague, its writers, composers, artists, it's a long list, and many of them world-known. If you want to find about that world, read about the world of Franz Kafka. Kafka family, I refer to them, say, if you want to know about my family, learn about the Kafka family. We were the same way, middle class, involved culturally, involved in the community, middle class, not wealthy, far from it, but not poor either. That is a vibrant part of the community, vibrant beyond the number, that small number of 30,000 out of 1 million. And also culturally and historically to this day. Does this answer your question? I don't know, sure.
Oh, yes, you mentioned Patton coming in 1945 and liberating the camp, and basically that was the end of the war. And then you also mentioned the communists coming in 1948, right? So I'm just wondering what happened in the intervening 3 years between 1945 and 48, where who was in control in those 3 years between 1945 and 48? Was it the communists or the Americans?
Prague was just on the eastern edge of, that is, the farther west the communists took over. Now, mind you, 45, I was in bad shape, physically. It took me 2 years before I was physically able to run to catch a bus that was on the corner. My concern was not much about politics, but safety and food. How to find enough food for the table. My then wife, had contracted, among other things, tuberculosis. And to get enough food into the house was a full-time job. So I was not concerned with the politics of the moment. You can read about it. There's ample literature. You remember this Jan Masaryk, the son of Thomas Masaryk, who was murdered by the communists. There was a struggle between the Western ideology and the communists. But I was not involved other than being a victim of both, of the communists.
So since you mentioned the concentration camps,
Wait.
what work did you have to do in the concentration camps?
What work? Yeah. Well, different concentration camps was different work. The first one was mostly in 1941, building roads and construction on the road. In Theresienstadt, a lot of small jobs here and there, and it would take a little time to explain how Theresienstadt worked. I was not employed or not engaged in a one job. I did all kinds of things. At the last camp, Kaufering, it was largely slave labor building underground factories. All that with a minimum of food. That is, from 1939 on, food was a heavy concern. Our food intake was minimal. When it came into 44, 45, we got 400-500 calories of food a day, barely enough to keep a body alive. Now, when you add to that hard labor, and I mean hard labor, 12-hour shifts, carrying cement sacks, hungry and cold. It was an activity that lead invariably to death by starvation.
Thank you. How did you manage to survive emotionally, psychologically?
I think that I've described it before. How did I survive psychologically? Living in a different world than the one that surrounded me. And that held true for everybody. That is, yes, we were under the dictatorship of the worst kind, a cruel and deadly place. But what they could not do is corrupt our minds, corrupt our souls. That is, we knew what we were, and we lived up to these ideals of a fair, open, and just community. We cared for each other.
What I was thinking was now, currently, like once you were liberated and you settled.
I tried to live a sensible life. You know, it's been a lot of years since I've been married to my first wife for 25 years. I'm married now for 37 years to a wonderful lady who happens to be skiing right now. And I approve of it. She should keep moving. mentally and physically. And she is involved. So am I. So participating in life to the extent that I can, and part of it is to talking to people like you. That is, keeping the memory alive of those who perished and somehow justify what they were doing while they were doing it. Most of them didn't survive. A handful did. I'm sort of a leftover, a shard dug out somewhere.
Hi. I have sort of two questions. One is, where were you at in your life when you went into hiding? Were you still in school? How much schooling did you get? And what was your period of hiding? What was that about? What was that experience?
In hiding, outside Prague, about 50 kilometers away, in a place called Lobkovice. Not that this is terribly important. Farmhand, essentially, working on a farm and it didn't take long before I became the assistant to the person who had leased the place. He realized that I knew how to read and that my mind was working. So I became sort of a mini boss of sorts. But I kept learning, and I think that is something that stayed with me, that I kept reading, I kept asking questions, and I'm afraid I didn't do enough of it. That is the one thing which I feel I should have pursued more. After the war, I should have worked very, very hard to get a degree of this and that, to have a career, and I did not, mostly because of my first wife needing the full attention. And then on the other hand, not having done that, being an artist, a thinking artist, and a reader, and a person involved in the community, I somehow managed. Did I achieve fame? No. Did I become wealthy? Of course not. But I think that I've solved a very personal problem, to live a sensible life. And I think that is something to which I could point when people ask me, what made you what you are? Yes, I'm a survivor with all the ails. You know, if you know any 96-year-old, you know what it is. But I've learned to live a sensible life. I think they cannot put it any other way. Could I have done more? Most likely, yes. Looking back, I feel, yes, I should have helped out more here and learned about that. But I still have a fair knowledge about the world around me and in science. I'm not, you may not hear it, but I've learned a few things. And that is really the answer that I have. What counts is the kind of life that is appropriate for me, for my character, and to know myself a little bit. Well, know myself well? No, of course not. But sufficiently well to live a sensible life and to be able to come to speak to you. Somebody's got a microphone somewhere.
Thank you for speaking today. I just had a question about how did you deal with your resentment, if you had any.
Speak up a bit more, please.
Oh, sure. Did you deal with any resentment towards German people and have a certain resentment towards people in general and want to shut people out after that experience?
The one thing I've learned, not really learned, but thought through. The question, let me go back to a little incident. In the last camp, Kaufering, as the Third Reich was collapsing, you were talking to each other inmates. And one person stood up and said, when the war comes to an end, I'll find myself a German and shoot him. And the group stood up and said, no, you can't do that, because you may be possibly shooting the one person who, unlikely as it is, or was, would have helped the Jew. That is, we dealt with the question of hatred from the very moment on. And I knew, then by instinct and later on by deliberation, that hate is destructive, is self-destructive. Hating anybody is not going to help any one of us. To understand, to be involved, yes, but to hate, no.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for being here today and sharing your stories. I know you said you're an avid reader, and I was just curious what books have been kind of the most affecting, maybe not having at all to do with the Shoah, but in your life.
Oh dear. You know, you come to my library, you have to be very careful not to go for upper shelves, they could fall down on you. So you may have gathered that I speak a few languages. Czech, German, French. I can read other languages, English too. And I'm trying to think which book was it most that influenced me. I don't really know. But I'm as a well-read, as an average person in New York, as a well-read, you know. And by the way, I tend to speak old, tend to read old things. So yeah, I love Moby Dick, Mark Twain, Pascal, Voltaire, Montaigne. I can quote Faust passages. That is, being involved in other cultures is a part of being involved. That is, trying to learn about the mind. The founders of this country read the same books that I'm reading these days, and I'm enjoying it. So reading is one of my pleasures, reading and listening to music. It is painting and music that are keeping me alive emotionally. And music, by and large, early Baroque and Baroque. But please, that's a prejudice. I know it. Late 19th century music, I cannot, it doesn't give me the pleasure that a Bach cantata is.
Would you like to come out?
What do you think is going to happen?
Sam.
What do you think is going to happen when your generation of Holocaust survivors are no longer here?
When I returned after camps, the world did not want to hear. Nobody wanted to hear. They said, come on, you're free, live it up. And it took about 20 years before the world could even mention the word Shoah, before it was even a working term. I think, I'm not sure, it was about the time of the Eichmann trial that the mentality changed. We, survivors, in a small way, and so is this museum, is trying to keep the memory alive, the memory of a community or communities. I feel that we survivors have done a decent job. Today you can go to New Zealand, Finland, and a country in South America. You go to a place of higher learning, there will be a course on the shore, if not a department. So the shore, our experience, our thinking, our ideas are alive. Are going on. And it fills me with some optimism that somewhere somebody is studying what went on, trying to do what is needed so that the scoundrels would not take over. So I think we have succeeded. I'm not trying to get too proud about it. We see in too many countries nowadays where national exceptionalism, where truth with capital T is predominating in this and that place. But we've done something, and I think we've sort of managed to get something rolling that may endure.
I think I know the answer to this question, but I want to test my theory. What was your religious upbringing like, and did it affect your desire to be a sensible man, or live a sensible life, I should say?
My upbringing was typical Central European cultural Jew. Yes, my grandparents went to shul on high holidays. I went with them. I am a Jewish non-believer. We are both my wife and I, the son, are members of a synagogue here in Brooklyn. A Jewish-paying and involved members. A believer? No. But, well, particularly my wife, I'm less so, well versed in the tradition. Yes, I've studied Talmud, and I've learned from it. I'm still involved in learning. This past Monday, was it Monday? No. Friday? No. Thursday. A lecture from a professor from the JTS, Jewish Theological Seminary, a very, very learned man, Mr. Kramer, and thoroughly enjoying it, and being part of the cultural life that is not a religious life. The cultural life doesn't mean I don't know about religion. It's not emotionally fit for me. I can go at length, but does it answer your question? Good.
Thank you for sharing your experience.
Can't hear you.
Thank you for sharing your experience. I was wondering at the camps if any of the guards seemed empathetic or reluctant.
Wait, I didn't.
Do you want me to?
I'm sorry, I didn't get your question.
At the camps, did any of the guards seem empathetic or reluctant to carry out their dehumanizing responsibilities?
I'm not sure I got your question. What you're really asking is the attitude of inmates versus guards.
Yes.
Is that it? Well, the guards were hardened party members. In fact, even within, I sense, I'm not absolutely sure about it, though there may be studies about it, that the guards in concentration camps were borderline cases. chosen by brutality, by heartlessness, by mental limitation. That is, to would kill somebody without giving it another thought. So there was no communication between us. And we had contempt for these people. We understood them. We knew to be very, very careful around them. Those were dangerous people who would kill without giving it another thought. So the communication between prisoners and guards was one of high tension. You may be able to read about it. I'm not willing to expand on it by giving you examples of particularly brutal nastiness, but you can read about it.
Yes, thank you. Did you ever go back to Czechoslovakia, specifically after the fall of communism?
Yeah.
And could you
Yeah.
trace back some of
understand
your
your
past?
question.
Thank you.
When I left Czechoslovakia, I was not a welcome person there. Now, mind you, I had been born in Vienna, so I had that sort of bad mark on me. I was a Jew, second bad mark. A survivor, who needs them? It was a precarious life of a survivor, very, very much on our own. The reason I eventually wound up here is that my first wife had an uncle here who had managed to get out of Europe in 1938. And that brought me to this country. But apart from it, my father was he was in the insurance business, but his hobby was sociology. He was very much involved in sociology at a time when that field, sociology, was a somewhat disrespected field of social studies. It was sort of suspect at that time. Because of him, and then even as a teenager in the house, the question of what is a good government, what is a decent government, is something that was discussed over the table. It may have been a course in sociology without being aware of it, but thinking about the well-ordered society is something that was always on my mind, and the seeds go back to the 1930s, when I was 10, 12, 14 years old. It's still there. Now, I could elaborate on that. I'm not quite sure I got a full question. Yes. Well, go stand up and speak very loud.
She wanted to know if you went back to Czechoslovakia.
Oh, did I go back to Czechoslovakia after? Well, after 48, it was impossible. No, it was possible, but by God, who would want to go back into dictatorship? You may have heard about the Stansky Affair. So Jews were not exactly welcome in Czechoslovakia, where there was a time of persecution of Jews. In 1989, 89, 90, something like that, after the fall of the communists, my wife and our then yay-high son decided to go back to Prague. Now, I know Prague culturally, architecturally, and historically quite well. And so I said, let's go back. I went back, And I didn't need maps of Prague at all. It's still in my head. What was different was the streetcars running in different streets and had different numbers. But otherwise, old Prague was the same. What was not the same was my attitude. That is, my hometown anymore. My community had gone. Yes, there's today a Jewish community in Prague, and they're mostly from Eastern Europe, largely Russian, culturally Chabadniks. That is so a kind of Judaism that I have not that much affinity with. So it wasn't my hometown, and I don't feel that I've missed, that somewhere there is something that I'm attached to know. I know the Alt Neuschule, I know the architecture of the various synagogues, I know the architecture of Prague better than most people of Prague. But it's not my hometown. I think my hometown now is Brooklyn.
Oh, sir.
You had mentioned that you think your generation, the survivors, you had mentioned that your generation, the survivors, have done a decent job of creating something that would be durable. What would be your advice as to what we should do going forward in the future to keep this memory alive? What do we need to do?
I think that I'm going to tell you what I tell every other community of this sort. I say, stay involved. There'll be one or another among you who will carry the memory by telling you yourself or having your children tell it. And that is how we carry on, how we've carried on for hundreds of years and many generations. Tell each other the stories and hold up the ideas that kept us going. Respect for life, for each other. And I think if you can do that, I'll charge you with that. Do tell your children, keep thinking, keep telling it, and I appreciate you listening to me.
Once you began to publicly speak about...
Speak up.
Once you began to publicly speak about the Holocaust, did you maybe meet any other survivors and personally bond with them or reunite with a familiar face from that time?
I do not move in survivors' circles. I'm part of this museum. I'm part of the Speakers Bureau here. That is how I got to this afternoon. I'm not sure how to answer that, except saying I do what I can do.
She was wondering if you've met many survivors.
Oh, did I meet many survivors? No, there are none left. There are no survivors left. Yes, there were some survivors I was in touch with. And right now I know only one lady who's in is in Manhattan. I talk to her every now and then over the phone. I don't think I should mention her name. Yes, so we talk like all old people. She wants to talk about her rheumatism. And, like all old folks, you compare each other's aches and pains. And I'm not in for that. I don't like this discussion. I'm ready to talk politics any moment. But rheumatism, knees, back pains, oh no, forget it.
Can you talk about your art and kind of how your experiences inform that, or if it's more informed from what goes on today, and where can we see that art if we'd like to, if it's possible?
Well, verbally it's very difficult. You know, what you may do some point is, if you remember my name, Fred Terna, look it up on the internet. And very fortunately, our son knows how to handle computers. I don't. So he's put some of my artwork in there in various categories. I don't know. You have two enemies, computers and cell phones. And so you can find about it. Now, art generally. As an artist, the Shoah and the Tanakh are my subject matters. You cannot see it. I do not illustrate. It cannot be done. Yes, it can be done badly. What kept me from illustrating is Goya. His disasters of war are graphics, that is, print, and he said everything that can be said, and I feel very much that he said it all. I'm not going to add to that. I paint feelings, attitudes, ideas, but you may not see them immediately. Now that you've heard me talk, you somehow may be able to connect. Yes, art is my mode of communication. It is a hidden communication for somebody who looks at the surface. I've learned over the years how to express my feelings. So I get to a canvas and I put down color and shapes. What is it about? About my feelings of that moment, except that I'm the one that did it. So the painting contains me, my ideas, and visually it may not agree with you, which is fine with me. I'm very lucky. People buy my art. Why? I don't know. But they like it. They're willing to live with it. But if you know, there are some themes that come back again and again. I mean, Auschwitz, the flames, concentration camp. But this is not the kind of stuff you'd like to have in your French provincial bedroom. So it's not an easy thing to live with. Some people buy it, some don't. But they buy it for who knows what reasons. I just have a hard time describing paintings without showing them.
You said you came to this country in 1962, is that right?
No.
What?
52.
52, okay. How did you get out of where you were? Did you have to escape? How did you get out? Did you escape to get out from the communists?
No. I escaped from the communists in 46 and went to Paris. I lived in Paris to 1950 and came eventually over here in 52.
In closing, I have a closing question for you, a little bit about the art that you helped facilitate the donation to the museum, which can be seen in our exhibit that just opened called Rendering Witness. Would you mind telling us a little bit about that?
You know, I have painted a lot of paintings over the years. My studio is still full with paintings that have not sold. And various museums ask me for work. The Museum of Yad Vashem has some. The Washington Museum has about 30 odd things. Lochamei Hagetaot has a big pile of drawings. Yes, my work is here and there. And I'm not really interested in what happens to the art. To me, when I paint it, that is an important moment. And how do I separate myself from a painting? It's another problem for painters generally. But my way of doing it is the signature. once I sign a painting, I sort of my signal, it isn't mine anymore. Let it go out into the world and fight for itself. Yes, the museum here has some of my work, and there will be a show. In fact, let me put a plug in for the museum. The important thing is to communicate what was. You may or may not have things that pertain to the Shoah in your family possessions. They were technically called ephemera. That is, little things, letters, documents, things that pertain to the Shoah, and I'm sure that they are valuable to you now, but they're invaluable for people who will live 100 years from now. And the museum is going to preserve them. So it is really a plea on behalf of the museum to give those items, they may not have much meaning to you now, or may have only a hidden meaning to you, but become meaningful to generations to come. Your grandchildren will not miss them, but the generations down the line would. So please, if you have something that you feel is valuable, not to you, but to future generations, give it to the museum. Let them decide whether it should be kept and how it should be kept.
Thank you all for coming, and let's thank Fred one more time.